In the 1980s, animation studios looked parents dead in the eye and said, "This one's gonna scar your children." While Saturday morning cartoons sold cereal, a shadow market of animated films was pushing boundaries so hard they shattered. Blood, existential terror, and imagery that would make a grown adult pause the VCR. You think you know 80s animation? You don't. These 10 films prove it. Heavy Metal, 1981. Before Marvel turned metal into iron suits, there was a film that turned heavy metal music into a full-blown animated nightmare odyssey. Heavy Metal wasn't just a movie. It was a cultural grenade lobbed straight into the laps of unsuspecting audiences who assumed animation meant Disney. Based on the legendary Heavy Metal magazine, this anthology film stitched together multiple stories linked by a glowing green orb called the Loch Nar, described as the sum of all evil in the universe. And the film earned that description with every single frame. Each segment was handled by different animation teams, giving the whole thing a fractured, fever dream quality that made it feel like flipping through the most deranged comic book ever printed. One story follows a cabbie in a dystopian New York. Another drops you on a war-torn alien planet. Another is basically a courtroom drama that dissolves into pure chaos. The connective tissue is thin, but the vibe is thick, drenched in a soundtrack featuring Black Sabbath, Blue Oyster Cult, Cheap Trick, and Devo. Critics were split right down the middle. Roger Ebert gave it a lukewarm review, calling it the story of some grotesque animals and bizarre sex. But the cult audience didn't care about Ebert. They turned up at midnight screenings, stoned and mesmerized, and turned Heavy Metal into one of the defining cult animated films of the decade. It cost around $9.5 million to make and earned over $20 million at the box office, which in 1981 was a legitimate hit for an animated film aimed squarely at adults. The film was so controversial in some markets that it faced censorship battles for years. It took over a decade for a proper home video release in certain countries. Heavy Metal didn't just push the envelope. It set the envelope on fire and mailed the ashes. Fire and Ice, 1983. Ralph Bakshi and Frank Frazetta, two titans of fantasy art and underground animation, joined forces, and the result was Fire and Ice, a rotoscoped barbarian epic that looked like a Frazetta painting dragged kicking and screaming into motion. If you've ever seen those iconic oil paintings of muscular warriors battling prehistoric beasts on jagged cliffs, this film is literally that. Alive and moving. The story is straightforward. An evil ice lord named Necron is expanding his glacier to consume the world, and a lone warrior named Larn teams up with a mysterious figure called Dark Wolf to stop him. It's not Shakespeare. It's not trying to be. What it is trying to be is the most visually savage animated fantasy film ever committed to celluloid, and on that front, it delivers hard. The rotoscoping technique involved filming live actors and then tracing over their movements frame by frame, giving the animation an eerily fluid, almost uncanny quality. Characters move like real humans, but they exist in a world of impossible landscapes and monstrous creatures. The effect is hypnotic and deeply unsettling in equal measure. Fire and Ice flopped at the box office, pulling in barely $1.5 million against its modest budget. Critics dismissed it as shallow and overly reliant on style, but the film's reputation grew enormously in the decades that followed. Robert Rodriguez spent years trying to get a live-action remake off the ground. Animators and fantasy artists cite it constantly as a foundational influence. Frank Frazetta himself considered it one of the purest translations of his vision. For a film the mainstream ignored, it left a crater-sized impact on fantasy art and animation that is still felt today. The fact that it was marketed anywhere near children's programming is genuinely baffling. Gandahar, 1987. René Laloux, the French animator who already proved with Fantastic Planet that he could make audiences question their entire reality, returned with Gandahar, also known in English as Light Years. And once again, he delivered something so alien, so philosophically dense, that calling it a cartoon feels almost disrespectful. Set in a utopian civilization called Gandahar, the story follows a warrior named Sylvain, who is sent to investigate a mysterious force that is turning the people of his world into stone. What begins as a simple quest narrative spirals into a mind-bending journey involving a giant mutant brain from the future, time paradoxes, and a race of deformed outcasts who were discarded by Gandahar's supposedly perfect society. The film essentially asks whether utopia can exist without creating something monstrous beneath it. The animation style is fluid and dreamlike, based on the artwork of Jean-François Crestin, known as Kaza. Every frame looks like a surrealist painting. The creature designs are grotesque and beautiful simultaneously. Flowers bleed, landscapes breathe. It's the kind of film where you're not entirely sure if you're watching science fiction or a hallucination. In France, Gandahar was a respected release, but when Harvey Weinstein's company brought it to the United States under the title Light Years, they had Isaac Asimov rewrite the English dialogue and chop the film into something barely recognizable. The American version was a shadow of the original, stripped of its nuance and philosophical weight. The French version remains a masterpiece of adult animated science fiction, a film that treats its audience like intelligent beings capable of grappling with complex ideas. It is one of the most underappreciated animated films of the entire decade, and finding the uncut French version is an experience that will rewire how you think about what animation can accomplish. Starchaser, The Legend of Orin, 1985. Let's be blunt, Starchaser was a Star Wars ripoff. Everyone knew it, the studio knew it, the audience knew it. But here's the thing. It was a wildly ambitious, visually stunning, and shockingly violent Star Wars ripoff that happened to be animated in 3D, making it one of the first animated features ever released in stereoscopic 3D in the United States. The plot follows Orin, a young slave working in underground mines controlled by a tyrannical overlord named Zygon, who uses a robotic army and a dark religion to keep the slaves in line. Orin discovers a magical sword hilt buried in the ground, escapes to the surface world, and teams up with a smuggler named Dag, who is basically Han Solo with a different haircut. The parallels to Star Wars are so blatant that Lucasfilm reportedly considered legal action. But beneath the derivative surface, Starchaser has a mean streak that separates it from anything George Lucas ever made. Characters are brutally dispatched. The villain is genuinely menacing. There are scenes of whipping, torture, and implied cruelty that would never fly in a family film. The animation is gorgeous for its era, blending traditional hand-drawn work with early computer-generated imagery in ways that were genuinely cutting-edge for 1985. Film bombed commercially, earning just about $3 million against a substantial budget. Critics savaged it for its obvious borrowing, but over the years, a cult following developed among animation enthusiasts who appreciate its technical ambition and its willingness to go darker than any space adventure aimed at young audiences had any right to go. It's a fascinating artifact, a film that stole from the best and then added a layer of grime and violence that made it something entirely its own. Rock and Rule, 1983. Nelvana, the Canadian animation studio that would later bring you Care Bears and Babar, first made Rock and Rule, a post-apocalyptic rock opera about a demon summoning concert. Read that sentence again. Care Bears, Babar, demon summoning concert. Same studio. Set in a future where humans have been replaced by evolved animals after a nuclear war, Rock and Rule follows a band whose lead singer, Angel, has a voice so powerful that it can open a portal to another dimension. A villainous rock legend named Mock wants to use her voice to summon a demon during a massive concert. The rest of the band has to rescue her before the demon is unleashed on the world. The soundtrack is unbelievable. Debbie Harry of Blondie performs Angel's songs. Lou Reed voices and performs for Mock. Cheap Trick and Earth, Wind and Fire also contributed tracks. The music alone makes this film worth seeking out, but the animation is equally impressive, blending traditional techniques with some of the earliest uses of computer animation in a feature film. Rock and Rule was a catastrophic box office failure. Nelvana nearly went bankrupt producing it. The film barely received a theatrical release and was essentially buried for years. But it was rediscovered on late-night cable television and VHS bootlegs, slowly building a devoted following. Animation historians now consider it one of the most ambitious and underrated animated features of the 1980s. The character design is sharp and expressive. The world building is surprisingly detailed, and the central villain Mock, with his gaunt frame and predatory charisma, is one of the great unsung animated antagonists. It's a crime this film isn't more widely known. When the Wind Blows, 1986. This is the one that will genuinely break you. When the Wind Blows, based on Raymond Briggs' graphic novel, tells the story of Jim and Hilda Bloggs, a retired British couple living in the countryside who attempt to survive a nuclear attack by following outdated government pamphlets from World War II. They whitewash their windows. They build a lean-to shelter from doors. They believe the authorities will come to help. Nobody comes. The animation style is deliberately gentle and warm, using the same soft, hand-drawn look that Briggs employed in The Snowman. Jim and Hilda are sweet, bumbling, and heartbreakingly innocent. They bicker about tea and reminisce about the war years with nostalgic fondness. And that gentle tone makes what happens to them exponentially more devastating. As radiation sickness slowly takes hold, they deteriorate. Their hair falls out. Their skin changes. They grow weaker, and through it all, they keep reassuring each other that the government will sort everything out, that things will go back to normal. The film never shows the horror explicitly. It doesn't need to. The horror is in the gap between their optimism and the audience's knowledge of what is actually happening to them. David Bowie produced the soundtrack. Roger Waters of Pink Floyd contributed the title song. The voice cast featured John Mills and Peggy Ashcroft, two legendary British actors who brought devastating warmth to the roles. When the Wind Blows was released during the height of Cold War nuclear anxiety and hit audiences like a freight train, critics praised it as one of the most powerful anti-war statements ever animated. It is not entertainment. It is a gut punch disguised as a cartoon, and anyone who watches it carrying expectations of a light-hearted British animation will be absolutely shattered by what they experience. Wizards, 1977. Ralph Bakshi shows up again because the man simply could not stop making animated films that traumatize people. Wizards, technically released in 1977 but deeply embedded in 80s cult video culture, is a post-nuclear fantasy about two twin wizard brothers. One, named Avatar, is a kind, nature-loving sorcerer. The other, named Black Wolf, is a fascist dictator who discovers a projector containing old Nazi propaganda footage and uses it to inspire his mutant army to conquer the world. Yes, an animated fantasy film about the literal weaponization of Nazi imagery. Bakshi was not playing around. The film's visual style is a chaotic blend of traditional animation, rotoscoping, and actual archival footage. Battle sequences incorporate real World War II combat footage tinted and filtered to look like animated warfare. The effect is deeply disturbing, intentionally so. Bakshi wanted audiences to feel the real weight of fascist imagery rather than treating it as abstract evil. Wizards was made on a shoestring budget of less than $2 million, and it shows in places. The animation is inconsistent, sometimes beautiful and sometimes rough, but the ideas driving the film are powerful enough to overcome any technical limitations. The climax, where Avatar confronts Black Wolf, contains one of the most shocking and darkly funny endings in animated film history, a moment that subverts every fantasy cliché with a single, brutal act. The film was a modest theatrical success and became a staple of midnight movie screenings throughout the late 70s and 80s. It remains one of Bakshi's most accessible works while still being far too intense, politically charged, and visually jarring for any child to process. It's a war film wearing a cartoon mask, and the mask keeps slipping. The Plague Dogs, 1982. From Martin Rosen, the same director who made Watership Down and scarred an entire generation with animated rabbit carnage, came The Plague Dogs. And somehow, impossibly, it's even more harrowing than Watership Down. Based on Richard Adams' novel, the film follows two dogs, Rolf and Snitter, who escape from an animal research laboratory in the English Lake District. Rolf has been repeatedly drowned and revived as part of endurance experiments. Snitter has had brain surgery that causes him to hallucinate and confuse reality with dreams. They flee into the wild, hunted by the military, the media, and farmers who believe they might be carrying bubonic plague. The animation is stunningly beautiful, capturing the harsh, windswept landscape of northern England with watercolor precision. But that beauty is in constant tension with the brutality of the story. The laboratory scenes are unflinching. Animals are shown in cages, subjected to procedures, and disposed of with clinical indifference. Rosen does not look away. and he does not allow the audience to look away either. The film was severely cut for its American release, losing nearly 15 minutes of footage deemed too disturbing. Even in its truncated form, it was considered one of the most upsetting animated films ever made. The uncut British version is significantly more graphic and emotionally punishing. John Hurt voices Snitter with a fragile, broken gentleness that makes every moment of the dog's suffering land like a physical blow. The Plague Dogs made almost nothing at the box office and was barely distributed, but it has since been recognized as one of the finest and most courageous animated films ever produced, a work of genuine artistic bravery that refuses to soften reality for the sake of comfort. If you can handle it emotionally, it is essential viewing. Vampire Hunter D, 1985. Before anime conquered the Western mainstream, Vampire Hunter D crept through the gates and showed everyone what Japanese animation was truly capable of when it stopped caring about being polite. Set in the year 12,090 AD, in a post-nuclear world where vampires rule the remnants of civilization, the film follows D, a dhampir who is half human and half vampire, as he is hired to rescue a young woman from the clutches of an ancient and powerful vampire lord named Count Magnus Lee. The world building is extraordinary. This is gothic horror fused with science fiction, where vampires command advanced technology and medieval castles sit alongside ruined highways. Werewolves, mutants, and demonic creatures populate a landscape that feels like Bram Stoker and Mad Max had a fever dream together. The animation by Ashi Productions is fluid, atmospheric, and dripping with gothic grandeur. Vampire Hunter D was based on Hideyuki Kikuchi's wildly popular novel series, illustrated by Yoshitaka Amano, who would later become famous for his Final Fantasy artwork. The film's character designs carry Amano's ethereal, otherworldly elegance, giving D a visual presence that is equal parts beautiful and terrifying. In Japan, it was a direct-to-video release, part of the booming OVA market. But in the West, it became one of the gateway drugs for an entire generation of anime fans. It circulated on bootleg VHS tapes, was traded at conventions, and was whispered about in video store aisles. The violence is graphic, the atmosphere is suffocating, the themes are mature and uncompromising. It proved definitively that animation could be a vehicle for serious adult horror storytelling, and it opened a door that would never close again. Without Vampire Hunter D, the Western anime explosion of the 1990s might have looked very different. Grave of the Fireflies, 1988. There is no debate. Grave of the Fireflies is not just the most devastating animated film of the 1980s. It is one of the most devastating films ever made in any medium, any language, any format. Directed by Isao Takahata at Studio Ghibli, it tells the story of Seita and his little sister Setsuko, two children struggling to survive in Japan during the final months of World War II, after firebombing destroys their home and kills their mother. The film opens by telling you that Seita dies. This is not a spoiler. It is the first scene. You know from the very beginning that this story does not end well. And yet, as you watch these two children scavenge for food, shelter in an abandoned hillside bunker, and try desperately to hold on to some fragment of childhood joy, the inevitability of their fate makes every moment more agonizing, not less. Takahata's direction is restrained, almost documentary-like. He doesn't manipulate. He doesn't use swelling music to tell you when to cry. He simply shows you what happened and trusts you to feel the full, crushing weight of it. The animation is breathtakingly beautiful, with fireflies glowing in the darkness like tiny fragments of hope that flicker and die. Grave of the Fireflies was released as a double feature with My Neighbor Totoro, which is perhaps the most emotionally violent programming decision in cinema history. Audiences went from Totoro's warmth and wonder directly into Takahata's merciless portrait of wartime suffering. Reports from Japanese theaters describe audience members sobbing uncontrollably. Roger Ebert called it one of the greatest war films ever made. Film critic Ernest Rister declared that anyone who could watch it without tears was not human. It has been studied in universities, screened at memorials, and cited by filmmakers across the globe as a life-changing experience. Studio Ghibli is often associated with Hayao Miyazaki's fantastical adventures, but Takahata's masterpiece remains the studio's most powerful achievement. It does not entertain. It bears witness. And it proves, beyond any argument, that animation is not, was never, and will never be just for kids.